모스트 포던 팟캐스트.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to Most Modern. Happy New Year to everybody, 2025. I think we have a lot in store for you all this year. Looking forward to build up our momentum from starting off in 2024. And I think there's a lot of exciting things to talk about coming into the new year. We're actually going to start this episode off talking about a small country in East Asia, South Korea, and look at its real estate market a little bit. Just one important number right here, year on year, average sale price of new apartments in Seoul up 27% since 2023,
Wow.
which marks an incredible rise in cost of housing. Of course, this is a theme that we've seen all over the world the past few years, especially since the pandemic. And we've also noticed that it's made a huge effect on politics and culture in all these places too. But Korea seems to be in a very sort of acute position. So I think, Minkoo, it's a good opportunity for us to discuss a little bit about what's going on and see if we can connect some of the phenomena occurring in South Korea to larger trends happening globally.
Yeah, well, it is a small country, but in the past few weeks, it was packed with heavy news in terms of like the president declaring martial law and then it being shot down within 2 weeks, and now an impeachment process. And then unfortunately there was also a plane crash in one of in Jeju Airlines. All my condolences.
Yeah, both in politics, but also in culture too. I mean, Squid Game came out, and Korean popular culture continues to be a huge boon to the economy and to its soft power. So it's an interesting place, no doubt.
It is. It was a country that's been very dynamic, and actually this increase of the housing price is astonishing, but not surprising. Because in the past 20 years, there was a saying in Korea that, if you have money, buy a house, you'll never lose. And I guess this number, the increase in the value, like 27%, that's massive. That's, I think, even more than the S&P 500 for the last year. So it is a interesting number, but it is also quite alarming. Because, as you mentioned at the early part of this podcast, that it is going to be increasingly more unaffordable, and now because now that there is this fall of the Junsei system and the rise of the rental market, I think the cost of living will be only going up from here.
Well, you mentioned Junsei, and we're going to get to that in 1 second, but why don't you take us on the ground? What's it like living in Seoul? What's the condition like? What are you looking for when you're trying to buy a house? Are you trying to buy a house?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not the best person to know and to have the pulse of the market now, because I left Korea to start my career in architecture and development in like 2012. So it's already 12 years past. But it is close to my heart, and I still think Seoul is my home. It's my hometown. My family's there. My wife's families are also there. So I've been trying to monitor the market closely, but there are many issues for sure. First of all, even if we just look at the housing market, and only about I can only speak about Seoul. You have to think about the market in two different sectors. One is the high-rise apartment complexes, and then the other are the low-rise townhomes and any type of other type of homes. They belong in a different category because the way they act in the market is totally different. The high-rise apartments the majority are condominiums. Those are developed by the conglomerates that you probably, and the listeners probably know, like Samsung, LG, those type of big names, corporates that does most of the businesses in Korea.
So make your TV and your living room.
Yeah, exactly. Make your TV and your living room, your wires, your internet cable, like whatever, you name it. So those were the drivers of that market. And even also from the demand side, they are the more desirable way to live. And probably the reflection of that is shown in the valuation, because even in the downtime like now, and a couple of years back when there was some crisis in the real estate market in Korea, the prices of these tall housing apartment complexes have slowly but steadily increased. And of course only talking about Seoul and its periphery. But the other type of alternative housing markets, those are facing quite a lot of challenges, especially because of the collapse of the Jeonse system in 2022.
So when you go to buy a house in Seoul in particular, and I think we keep on talking about Seoul because it is the mega city within Korea. I mean, Korea is a population of about 50 million people, but Seoul, I think Greater Seoul probably takes up a third to 40% of that entire population.
Yeah.
When you go to buy a house there, are you primarily looking for these condos, these sort of large apartment buildings? On a cultural level, why is that desirable?
Well, because of comfort and location. These large apartment complexes, they are professionally managed. They come with convenience, with parking lots, with its internal commercial buildings where you can shop and also have some cafes. The usual build conditions, the build quality are better than the smaller buildings, but I wouldn't say they're great. But they are traded with a premium, because I think it's also mentally, people think that if you live in one of those apartments, you're in the middle class, yes, or upper middle class. I mean, you probably have a car, you probably have kids, have family, stable family, you have stable income. So it relates to the thinking of stability, and you are making a living, you are proud of your place, and usually, although we're talking about like one building having hundreds of units and then a complex having like thousands of units, they, I think, become a community, like a forced gated community, which a society like Korea, where it is not a multicultural society. I mean, people more or less are the same type of people. They are Koreans. They go to the same school. They compete. They go to the same universities, and they also continue to compete after they enter the workforce. So that that feel of this gated society, actually, maybe as a sentiment, you can also relate it as a premium, like you're included, not secluded from that. So I think that plays a role too.
Yeah, and I also want to make a sort of urban observation about the high rise, which I would say is the second dominant form of housing in the world. One is a sort of single detached home that you see in a lot of the Anglosphere in particular, what we call suburbanism in a lot of places. But then you have the sort of suburban high rise that you see in East Asia in places like China, Taiwan, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea. And one reason for that too, I'd also point out, is because a lot of those buildings were built in the last, well, now 70 years, basically after World War II, in Korea's case, after the Korean War. And so not only was it a way to drive the economy of a country, but it was also a way to actually build that country itself, put people to work to build housing for them to live in, and then build the physical environment that was either didn't exist before because the country hadn't yet developed, or because it was destroyed during conflict. And so I think we see that happening actually in a similar way to sort of suburbanization in America, where the GI Bill brought a lot of people back and put them to work, put them in houses in the vast sort of expanses, all the space around the country, versus in East Asia, you really wanted to concentrate that around economic centers, mainly large cities.
Yeah, it's also a place where I was born into. Like I've been living in high rises probably all my life. I think a single family home is a foreign concept to me and probably most of the Koreans who live in Seoul. So I think there is a sense of security too, because it's a form of living that we are used to, and but unfortunately, although the number of buildings and the supply is still quite in a high level, it is still inaffordable. And surprise, surprise, you're seeing 27% of increase in the price year after year. Like, it is an issue for us. Like
Yeah,
my
and I think
generation, yeah.
we'll get to this later, but Korea also has the one of the worst replacement birth rates in the world. I think it's
Right.
0.7%, meaning in
0.7.
a couple generations there might just not be nearly as many Koreans as there are right
Mhm.
now. And so you can get a sense that as costs for living increase, the desire to have children or the inability to have children because you can't provide a place for them to live also, I think it goes up as well. And we're seeing that in a lot of places, in Korea, in the US to a certain extent, in Canada, in China for sure. But I think what the West has to its benefit is immigration. Other countries that aren't so maybe accustomed to, like you said, bringing in non-native born people, they can't keep up with the population decrease.
And
But
I do think it was an organic form of development because unlike the Western context where, you know, US has a vast land and, you know, you have multiple cities that have probably single noded cities that have a one center and it's a sprawl from that. But in Korea, you know, we have one city, like, so everything gets concentrated in that city, all the economical activities, all the political activities. Although now it's a different story, but it gets congested within the periphery of that city, one node, and then within that city, Seoul has multiple nodes. So it's like a collection of probably, you know, just a very rough imagination of conceptualization of Seoul will be, you know, imagine you have Manhattan, Boston, San Francisco, LA, all congested in one city, and you know each of that has its representation, and then these like high-rise apartment complexes, each of these nodes have a cluster of them, so it's all congested, and if you go to Tokyo, probably it's even worse.
yeah, I mean, the other thing that we have to also bring up about, you know, East Asia is the geography. In places like Korea, especially coastal areas, strangely, for whatever reason, mountains and the ocean tend to collide in East Asia. So when you're situated by the water because of economic reasons, say you want to have a port or you want to have some sort of harbor there, a lot of times your geography is actually extremely constrained. This is obviously the most extreme in a place like Hong Kong, but it exists in Taiwan for sure. It exists in sort of southeastern China. It exists in Singapore, not because of geography, mostly because of political boundaries. But and therefore you tend to pursue density because you can stack as many units as you can on top of one square meter, as opposed to spreading out. In America, it's much more flat and there's a lot more space. So I think a lot of these things contribute to the type of building that occurs, and sort of the verticalization of things tends to mean that you use a lot of concrete. There's no stick frame, for instance.
Yeah.
That's also because there's a lack of wood. And so all of these sort of combine to create the physical environment they see. I think what we're dealing with right now is what are the consequences of that system, whether it's
Yeah.
an economic or an aesthetic one.
Yeah, you can actually feel that. I felt that because I mentioned that I left Seoul 12 years ago to start my career abroad, and when I got back, when I visited Seoul, you know, I visit at least once every 2 or 3 years. You can see that the shape and the high line of the city, skyline of the city is increasing. Like just you don't have to really check, even look at the numbers. You can visually see the difference. So like the streets that you used to go for shopping or for coffee, the streets that you had like 2 to 3 story buildings that created that street, now it's like after like 5 years that street becomes 10 stories. After 5 years, that street becomes 20 stories. And now if you go there, like 40-story buildings, 50-story buildings are just everywhere. You can see these like as bar graphs. It appears, it grows. It's like almost touching the sky now. So that density add and the height of construction is, you know, and the congestion is being exacerbated.
For sure,
But and also because of these experiences, I think Korea probably is the main exporting item of Korean construction is the construction typology itself. So you know, now I've heard that we are at a speed of construction where you can build 3 stories per day for concrete, and that is to me insane. And it's more like a formula, right? It's not really like what you desire. It's not about, you know, the direction or the composition or whatever program you have. It's like you can build something in a very fast pace, and you can supply that building, in a very short time. And I think Korean construction industry has perfected that perfected that formula.
Well, yeah, for sure. It's gotten ultra efficient. And I think that efficiency is critical to supply enough abundance when it comes to especially housing. I think in the West, we have the opposite problem where we have generally good quality housing. We just don't have enough of it and can't build enough of it quickly enough.
Yeah, it's also because not just the speed of construction, but also the process. I do believe that in Seoul there is a form of community engagement. However, it's not as extensive as in the U.S. context. So, if we're talking about getting a zoning approval here, depending on the community you're in, we're talking about at least 6 months to a year, to even 2 or 3 years of just the permitting process. But in Korea, 3 months, you're done. You can start building. So, but regardless, we're having the same issue. So that kind of makes me wonder, like, is it really a demand and supply issue that we're talking about, or is it something deeper than that? Why is it so unaffordable? Like here in the US, we say, oh, it takes so long to build. But in Korea or in Asia, we're seeing that you can build 50-story buildings within 3 years, but still, like, the housing value is increasing 25-27% every year. So like it's not affordable for anyone to buy a place if you're not coming from deep pockets and with plenty of resources.
Yeah, well, let's dig into that because I think Korea offers an interesting example to one condition. We go over to China and we'll see a totally different situation as well. Minkoo, you mentioned Junsei. Can you tell us what Junsei is?
So Jeonse is a very unique housing system in Korea that was invented in the economical explosive era of Korea, where a city and the businesses were made. And in that time, it made sense because it's essentially a lump sum deposit. So if I'm looking for a house, I can buy a house and then I can put it out in the market as Junsei, and the tenant can come to me and say, hey, I'll give you 70% of the market value. Here's a cash you need. Then I let them stay in the house for 2 years for free. So that's how it works, and it worked in both ways.
You're the developer, or you've already bought the house?
If I'm the owner, I bought the house from the developer. I bought one apartment. Yeah.
Okay.
And when I put it back in the market, and it's let's say an investment property, I bought the house. I'm not going to live in it, but I'm going to put it on the market. The tenant comes to me and say, hey, I'm going to lease your house, but I'm not going to rent it on a monthly payment. Here's like 70% of the house value. I'll pay it as a lump sum on day one.
So you get 70% of your initial investment, basically? Even if you're leveraged? Even if you've taken a
Even if you're leveraged. Yeah, even if you're leveraged. Well, that's the decision of the tenant, because the tenant can see if the owner is leveraged or not, if he's if he bought it bought it as a whole, or if there's a debt on the house. The tenant can see it, and it's the tenant's decision to make.
Okay, so after 2 years, what happens?
After 2 years, the owner is supposed to return the deposit. So it's basically a lump sum deposit for you to get the right to live in that space for 2 years. So if effectively, for the tenant, it's beneficial because I get to keep the deposit, and it's safe. It's presumably safe. It's with the owner, and if I want to leave after 2 years or even before that, I can request the owner to return my deposit back, and I can move on and get another place. And technically, within that 2 years' time, your income will grow. You'll have some savings. Your equity will also grow. So it was a great tool for my parents' generation to use that system. You go into Junsei, your income grows, and then with that deposit and your income, you buy a home on the next round, or or how many rounds you need, you can do the Junsei, and then you grow your equity. So it was a great tool, and it made sense in the economic explosive era, where even if you just open a bank account, they give you like 13-15% of annual interest, just putting the money in the bank account.
So the owner is taking that money. Let's say you put 100 million won in to buy the apartment. You get 70 million won from your tenant. You put that 70 million into a bank account, and you're collecting 13-14% interest.
So it made perfect sense. So you don't need to ask for rent. Your interest becomes your rent payment. But similar to the U.S., Korea's interest payment is now, if you're getting 4.5%, it's very high. And for a very long time, after 2008, Korea also decreased the interest rate to like 0%, like somewhere near 0%. So that game didn't work anymore. However, the Jeonse system maintained. So people were still using that system, and the 70%, what was supposed to be at a capped at 70%, we were seeing some weird movements where the Junsei sometimes even go beyond the value of the apartment, and those type of kind of weird transactions were made in the market. So that kind of signaled that something's going on, and in fact, something was going on in 2022. So yeah.
Well, I'm curious what happened. It doesn't sound like it's going to end well.
Yeah. So you can kind of imagine from the owner's perspective. Okay, like the banks are not giving you the interest that you need, but you have this house. The rents are also not as high because of that existence of the Jeonse system. The rental market was almost non-existent. We're talking like in 2020, the rent for a studio was like $300 per month, or $200 per month. Yeah, US dollars per month. And but the value of a studio unit was at least $1 million, or somewhere in like $500,000-$600,000 US dollars. So it doesn't make sense, right? Like, how are you going to make money? What are you going to do with that 70% of cash in hand? So what people did was buy another home with that 70% cash. So at least you can increase your equity. And you lease it out with a Junsei, you get the 70% back, and then you buy another home. So you can think, you can imagine where I'm going with this model. Yeah. So technically, and it's not illegal. Like, even if you get a leverage, as long as your ratio is within expectation of the bank, the banks will keep lending you the money to buy the home, and the owners gets to own like 20, 50, 60, 80, 100, 150 units at the end. And it kind of made sense because you're growing your asset, and maybe some of your units you're going to turn that into rent. So as an aggregate, maybe it made sense in terms of your return ratio. But that worked when the interest rate was like low 2%. But what happened in 2022? The U.S. Fed started to increase the interest rates. The Bank of Korea, they also need to match, or at least be within like 1% plus and minus with the U.S. interest rate, so that we don't lose foreign investors. So what happened? The Bank of Korea increased the interest rate. The owners who were doing this play of Junsei buy a new home, Junsei buy a new home, who ended up with hundreds of units, they couldn't handle the debt payments, the interest payments to the bank. So they started to default in the homes that they owned. And what happened to the tenants who paid the lump sum? When the unit owner defaults, it goes to the auction, and whoever buys the auction has a right to kick out the tenant. And the tenant's Jeonse is technically protected by the government. There is this prevention program, like an insurance
Like
that's provided by a government
a
entity.
DIC type thing.
Yeah. However, the amount of these type of incidents were extraordinarily high in 2022 as a reaction to the interest rate growth. So it became a huge issue, huge scandal. So now, like there were investigations happening, and apparently there were some organized crime entities that were doing this type of system, abusing the system to create a Ponzi scheme, basically, and to just use it as a tool to churn cash. So it effectively collapsed. Many has tragically, couldn't maintain that stress, because losing your home is one, but losing your entire life saving through a scam is another. So if the government, or if you don't have anyone to support you and help you come out from that situation, you're just cornered. And there've been a lot of suicides, and many tragedy has happened in 2022.
It's not dissimilar to, if you bought a commercial building in 2019 and then the entire commercial real estate market collapsed in America, you would probably not own the building anymore. You probably would have defaulted at this point. But I think the issue is that, there's a handful of people like that. Not everyone's buying commercial real estate, but, the amount of volume when it comes to buyers and also units that are under the system, it seems to have created a much larger wave. And expose a lot more people to a much higher risk than what we've seen here. So, yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting because in the West, rents have gone up dramatically since COVID. It seems like they have, or at least cost of living in Korea has also gone up. But you also add on top this layer of not just like financial distress, but like social and cultural distress. Losing investment in your house is really distressing in the first place. Losing the money in your bank account is just distressing.
Right.
And I think we see that in, the other thing that happened this past week, a Squid Game came out, Squid Game season 2. And, there's a lot of social commentary in something like that about how difficult it is to survive in a ultra capitalist society. And I think that this is maybe one example of that.
Yeah, that's probably the reason why it's very difficult for me to even watch Squid Game, because I feel like, you feel like it's very close to reality. It's just a simple layer of abstraction, happening in that show. So you can easily think certain type of situations happening in reality in the real context, where that's a brutal form of capitalism. Jeonse, going back to Jeonse, I do think it was a very special structure of living that actually supported and suppressed the housing costs for a very long time, because of that, the rental market was suppressed quite a lot. But after this incident in 2022, we are seeing actually a birth of the rental market in Korea now in 2023 and 2024. And also the government is now encouraging even foreign investors to enter the market. So like Morgan Stanley, Hines, KKR, MNG, those type of REITs and global actors of real estate development are entering the Korean market for these type of specifically for rental housing. And I'm not talking about like 10 units here, 10 units there. I'm talking about at least 10,000 units of housing.
The mega complexes.
Mega complexes, and that's the goal of that the government is came out. They're targeting by 2035. They want to build 10,000 units of rental housing within Seoul and its periphery, so that they can tackle the housing affordability. But I don't know if it will be effective, if not just making the housing market worse.
Sorry, 10,000 units?
100,000 units. 100,000 units.
That's more like it, yeah.
Yeah, 100,000 units of just rental housing, and 50,000 units of mixed use developments.
So is this why is this Junsei sort of wave? Is this why the housing prices have gone up so much? What's the
not necessarily just because of that, but I do think that the housing prices of Seoul is I think the entire growth, the GDP of Korea, it's on two things right now. Like one is the semiconductor, the chip manufacturing, the high technology, like by Samsung, Hanwha, these type of groups, LG, and then the other is real estate. So the GDP growth, although it's quite low, expected growth is like 2% of next year. Majority of that is sustained by the increased value of real estate, which isn't healthy. But I do think that, you know, the government is still pumping in money to continue to hold that valuation, at least for the Seoul and its periphery neighborhoods, so that at least on the surface, you know, people won't be too mad at you.
Yeah. Well, I think this is an interesting time to connect to what's happening in Korea's neighbor in China, because I think they might be learning some lessons right now. I mean, others maybe have heard about the Chinese real estate market. The past few years has really, really gone through a lot of struggles.
Mhm.
A couple numbers here. I think at its height, up until 2017, 2018, 19 or so, real estate in China contributed 30% of the entire country's GDP, which was continually growing. We all heard
Yeah.
about the incredible growth of China since it opened up in the mid 90s. And if you look at a chart, basically that percentage of GDP has gone from 0 to 30% consistently. There has not been a large dip, versus other developed countries that has changed quite a lot. And I think, you know, if you also compare China's GDP current or percentage of real estate in its GDP to other countries in the past, Spain sticks out for being very close at 30% near the Great Financial Crisis, and then it has dipped down to 20%. Interestingly enough, Spain's economy is doing really well in 2024 versus China's economy, which is not. I think a lot of this again has to do with this idea. A lot of the things we talked about, whether regarding real estate development at a cultural and at a nation building level. The same idea where you want to own a home, there's stability in that home, there's both economic stability and also personal stability and security in that place. I also think that it has to do with stimulating economy, putting people to work. You know, the amount of, I think there's one figure, I don't have it off the top of my, over here, but I think off the top of my head, it's like China has used more concrete and steel in the past 20 years than the US has used in the past century, which is just incredible. So if you can think about all the inputs that go into building something, the economy is not just stimulated by selling that unit at the end of the day. It's also by all the things that contribute to that. And now you have a situation where China's way overbuilt. There's somewhere between 90 and 150 million excess units in the entire country. So, you know, whatever we take our population demographics at, let's say 1.4 billion, that's enough units to house like 30% of that. You know, if a unit is 2.5 or 3 people in a unit. So, and meanwhile, demographics are also dropping. China's also going through a population decline, and we can expect that within the next generation, that population is going to dip down below 1 billion. So you're going to have that delta between the number of people that need housing and the amount of housing that's available is going to continue to grow. So you continue to see this as potentially a house of cards. And I think one thing that it really does is create a sense of economic instability where people have leveraged to buy multiple units and now they can't sell them. So in the same case that the Junsei wiped out a lot of savings, I mean, in this case, you know, the average, let's say middle-class Chinese citizen, they still have money and equity in those units, but you might have 5 units that suddenly dropped precipitously and now they're worth very little. And I think if you think about it as a sort of social contract, maybe the government feels a lot bit of pressure that that contract has not been met. And especially in that region, in that sort of political climate, any sort of economic instability could lead to social instability, which the government does not want. And so I'm wondering if Korea is thinking about China in that regard.
Yeah, well, I think the one effect is actually the production of steel from China is starting a chicken game in other countries too. Like in Korea is also one of the, I would say, you know, depending on where you look at it, it's a beneficiaries of that. So at least I think the construction cost of building these high-rise apartments in terms of the steel costs have been lower because China's continuing to manufacture steel and they're trying to find ways to export very cheap steel to Europe, Africa, and other countries. And Korea is also one of the major importers of that. So I think these, although it's only about steel, I think these type of tendencies will happen in other sectors where China is going to, I think they're going to keep manufacturing what they do. And what they do well is to make things cheap, but still good quality. And they will be challenging other markets. And probably maybe that's why Trump is trying to increase the tariffs for such a drastic way. But then, who knows? Who knows
Yeah,
what will happen?
it's interesting because I also know one economic agenda for Chinese Communist Party is to increase the amount of domestic consumption, meaning try to export less, try to consume more and buy more things with the large sort of population that they have right now. But this cascading effect of all the consequences of a declining real estate market means people have less basically spending power and they buy less. And so it all compounds and it creates a sort of sense of desperation that I think it starts to become a bit palpable. I've been in China the past couple of years over the summers, and every year you can sense that people are just less willing to spend, especially compared to the increase, the moments where growth was really increasing, and maybe passive income, if you owned real estate or if you had stocks or interest in any corporation, was also increasing. Purses are a little bit tighter, and that has an effect all over the region for sure. I mean, Hong Kong is intimately tied to the Chinese economy. There's no doubt about it, and it has a large effect there. I mean, I think Hong Kong's real estate market declined year over year in the same time that Seoul went up 27%. I think Hong Kong's around like a negative decline of about 12%. And then it has, like you're saying, like consequences to larger economic forces and inputs. And there's this other you mentioned it. There's this other unknown, which is how the U.S. government is going to react under a new administration, especially around economic imports. But the interesting thing about that, like you're saying, as it affects to what we do here in the U.S., is if there's a high tax on those imports that go to constructing new homes that need to be made in America, is that also going to increase the cost of living here? And I think there's this balance that needs to be played. And a lot of people will say, based on the last Trump administration, that a lot of what he says he doesn't actually do. But I'm a little bit concerned about that here, because it's easy to say, oh, they're importing this much steel from China, this much lumber from Canada, this much whatever from wherever. Let's just increase that tariff by 10-15%. That won't be a big deal. We'll get all that money. But I think the trickle down effect will affect the US consumer and the home buyer and anybody who's living in a house quite a lot.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, where would the tariff go eventually? It will be showing up in the price tag of building. So if the tariffs go up, I don't think there will be, the material costs will go down to cater for that tariff increase. The material costs will be the same. It will be added tariffs coming in. So let's say if it's for lumber, most of the majority of the housing stock here is built with wood. So like, are developers going to take the hit of loss? Probably not, or maybe a little, but then it will eventually be passed to the buyer at the end. So, but I do think that although in paper the housing market still shows quite healthy returns, and it is showing that the demand is pretty high, but I don't think it necessarily means that we can push the value, the price of the housing more higher, because we're seeing a lot of, I mean, I couldn't even find a place that's appropriately priced for me to live. The average the average house price for a 2-bedroom apartment in Boston probably is around like $1 million or close to $1 million. So what would the tariff do? Probably increase that for like 10% maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's a theme that we've all been talking about. How do you increase abundance in housing? And the problem is, it's not like, I would say, it's like not like a phone or now a car where you can just do an over-the-air update and just change everything. Like you have to implement something, a policy change, and you won't see the consequence of that until at minimum 2 years down the line. And I think one thing that people are waiting for is the decrease in lending, at least the cost of money, and decrease of interest rates and mortgage rates. But I feel like that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, the Fed said after giving the recent rate cuts for 25 bips, they were saying that there will be less cuts next year. So like potentially two, and then I think the market is adjusting for only one rate cut, expecting one rate cut next year. So the cost of money, the cost of lending won't change that much. And with the tariffs, I mean, I don't know what we're talking about. I mean, we want the same thing, but what we see it's happening is kind of all against that.
Right.
So
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question. I mean, what do you think is going to happen in Korea? I mean, there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen around the world, but what does this mean
yeah,
for Korea in
uh,
particular? Because it does seem like there's things that are emblematic of some of the larger systematic issues around housing supply, economics, um, how that relates to what gets constructed in the built environment.
mhm.
But then Korea also has its own way of doing things.
Yeah, I do think that this yearly increase of housing value is not. I am skeptical of that continuing. Because we are at the brink of oversupplying, and I think there are a lot of subsidies still coming from the government side to increase the housing stock in Seoul and its periphery. Now they're talking about for the first generation uh, uh, satellite cities, they're talking about incentivizing to build more density and demolishing the existing and building taller, like 45 floors as a minimum for apartment buildings. So there is going to be continuing effort to increase construction and increase the number of housing but like we see in China and other places, um, Korea is at a brink of experiencing a plummeting population. Now the birth rate is it's popular at 0.7%. Koreans are at the at the blink of extinction. Actually, I think it may be within my generation's lifetime we're going to see the population of Korean population dropping quite significantly, and now like what happens after that? Like all this housing with high density housing, like will that be sustainable? Probably not. So I do think there will be, but I do think there will be a change of of mentality in terms of living, and that's actually my hope, and how I see it personally is that I'm not personally a fan of apartment living. Although I've been living in that type of apartments for all my life, but this sense of secludedness, the sense of premium, the sense of creating, thinking that you're living at a special town, a special place, uh, and you're like one of the winners of the competition. I think that fundamentally should change. And without that, I think people will still, want to live in these apartment complexes, still, thinking that, I'm like one of the, secured middle class, upper middle class, whatever. I think that type of mentality should, it will be very difficult to maintain that, because we're also, going into, there is in the short term political turmoil. I think we're also expecting, as I mentioned before, only 2% growth in the next year, and that is, I think, still a 2% is quite an ambitious target. It is likely going to be falling less than that. And US actually is going the other route. Like they're claiming that it's going to be a stronger economy, expecting like a 2.5% growth of next year. And the size of economy is so different. So the fact that Korea is only expecting a 2% increase is signaling a stagnation or a depression is coming. So I really doubt that the housing prices can maintain itself. Maybe there could be a polarization of housing costs where maybe like the creme de la creme of the apartments will stay in that value, but I think the rest will probably have to be corrected.
Yeah, it seems like in a lot of asset classes, um, the top 1% maintain its value quite well,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes increase. I'm not just talking about buildings. I'm also talking about like handbags and watches, cars, things like that. But yeah, I mean the overall sort of bluster and bullishness in a market tends to sort of correct itself pretty
But
drastically.
but from a developer's perspective, I mentioned that we're looking at a birth of the rental market. So there will be a lot of increase in supply of rental housing, which we've been seeing in the past 5 years. Like there were smaller scale rental apartments that are packed with subsidies and amenities, trying to expand that limited rental market, and even in Seoul as well. And I do think there will be more opportunities for that type of firms to provide more affordable housing for younger generations that are, more fitting to their modern lifestyle. So maybe it could be an opportunity for the creative thinking in terms of what's the best way to live, because the problems are there. Like it's an affordable, no one can afford a house. Can we make it affordable? Like are there subsidies out there to make it affordable? Even for the rental housing, can there be ways to approach it and look at it differently from the design perspective, which doesn't really cost a lot of money? So it is going to be another type of challenge that I think the developers can look at it from a different angle and try to approach it in a creative way where, because the problems are common and it's very clear. So maybe it's also an opportunity for people like me.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, I think that's it's a good place to end on. One of the motions of our show is really to figure out what's a better way to live. If you take the case of Junsei, it's a system that worked at one point in time, but the context around that system has changed. And so maybe it doesn't work as well. And you're seeing those shifts. One question that I think we have is, can we get in front of those changes before they nip us in the bud? And and in that case, really innovate. I think around building, it's hard because you're always asking for permission. That permission is based on risk assessment, and the cost of doing something wrong immediately is seen as greater than the cost of doing something wrong over a longer period of time, which is the opposite of tech, which is interesting. But I think that's a discussion for another day. But anyway, Minkoo, it was wonderful to talk to you about this. I think it's always interesting to get perspectives from around the world. And I think we'll continue to look for interesting cases of these types of situations that we can all learn from moving forward.
Yeah, it's a dynamic market out there. So which means there will be opportunities for the creatives. So I think I'll be definitely monitoring the Korean market very closely and trying to find out opportunities there. But it is in fact a very challenging but exciting market. So and that has a totally different set of difficulties. But I'm hopeful, and the way that after seeing the way that civilization worked by confronting situations like a martial law declaration and people gathering, that shows the positive side of the Korean society, where if there is a unjust, people really get active and try to, they put their hands on, try to fix things. So I do think that activeness and the way that people react to stress will eventually help resolve any type of challenges and situations later on, including the real estate market now. So we'll see.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트